first of all, we had to recover as an economy, and we have done that. I'm very proud of the work that we have done that has brought inflation down to less than 3%. The work that we have done to cap the cost of insulin at $35 a month for seniors, that's good work. There's more to do, but that's good work. My agenda includes what we need to do to bring down the price of groceries. For example, dealing with an issue like price gouging. What we need to do to extend the child tax credit to help young families. My values have not changed. I believe it is very important that we take seriously what we must do to guard against what is a clear crisis in terms of the climate. That value has not changed. My value around what we need to do to secure our border, that value has not changed.
Kamala Harris does her first non-scripted press interview since taking over the top of the Democratic ticket. Harris was joined by her running mate Tim Walz for a sit-down with CNN's Dana Bash to discuss a wide range of topics. Joining us to discuss, the Hill White House correspondent Alex Gangitano. Alex, Harris was not overly specific on details of her policy plans, and at times her answers seemed to meander a bit, but she navigated tough questions pretty well and made no glaring mistakes. Same could be said for Tim Walz. Seems to me this interview isn't going to change the dynamics of the race. What say you?
Yeah, I think that's true. Basically, I don't think she pushed her momentum any further than it has been, but I don't think she brought herself any back any steps. I think she avoided gaffes, but she also avoided making a lot of news. The vice president was really measured in her answers. She also wasn't pressed too hard when she was questioned about some of her changing policy positions. She gave pretty, clean answers, but didn't have anything that us reporters pulled out as a glaring takeaway. But she definitely was questioned on some of these policy changes that she's had, and her the biggest takeaway from those answers were that her values have not changed. Well, maybe her policy positions have changed from when she ran for president in 2020.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about that. Was one of the biggest questions going into the interview. How would she explain the liberal policy positions she's taken in the past? Harris was asked about issues like banning fracking, decriminalizing unauthorized border crossings, the Green New Deal. How did she reconcile those positions with the more moderate tone she's trying to strike in this campaign?
Yeah, she definitely was leaning more with that moderate tone and a tone that could appeal to swing state voters, especially on fracking. She said that she would not work to ban fracking, but she also, in saying that, she's reaching out to voters in Pennsylvania where fracking, is such a big contribution to their industries. Pennsylvania is a state that this election could come down to. So she definitely struck a more moderate tone on that. Dana Bash also questioned her about when she ran in 2020 and raised her hand as somebody who would maybe support decriminalizing border crossings. Instead, she says that she would, enforce the laws as president. That definitely is a shift in her more progressive thinking when she was running in the primary on the border. But I do think after, serving in the Biden administration got blamed for the influx of migrants at the border before the president's executive order months ago was implemented. And I think she wanted to reach out to moderate and undecided voters and say, I would be strict on the border if I'm elected president.
Harris's running mate Tim Walz did a lot of sitting and smiling while Harris spoke, but he was asked about some inaccurate comments he made about his military service and use of IVF treatment with his wife. These are questions that have dogged Walz since he was selected. How did he answer?
Yeah, so these two things, CNN's Dana Bash gave him an opportunity to clear up or to claim that this was just a mistake. When it came down to talking about using weapons of war, Tim Walz was never saw combat. He said that, he was talking in the context of school shootings and how, these weapons of war are used in those situations sometimes. And he said that his wife calls him out for his grammar not always being correct. He also, when asked about saying that his family used IVF, but also he meant just broad infertility treatments, he again said, I was talking about the struggles of infertility that some American families face. So he definitely tried to talk around some of these issues, but also just say, these are things that I still feel really strongly that, that guns should not, be in schools, or that families with infertility issues should be supported. And he brought it back to those core issues that were part of the point he was trying to make.
Let's talk about the Republican reaction to the interview. The Trump campaign put out a statement calling Harris a San Francisco radical, criticizing her for not talking enough about crime, immigration, and the economy. Do Republicans think the interview opened up lines of attack against Harris?
Well, former President Trump's first initial reaction to the interview was writing that it was boring on his social media page. So I do think, stemming from that, Republicans are trying to look for a line of attack here, but that the interview didn't really give them too many openings. Again, Vice President Harris was very measured. There were no gaffes. And she tried to appeal to the center, whereas Republicans are going to continue to paint her over the next 3 months as this radical, far left California politician. But her saying that she wouldn't ban fracking, or her talking about how she wants to build an economy for the middle class on day one, she definitely tried to appeal to these moderate voters. So I think Republicans will be, trying to find ways to still paint her as a progressive. Well, she definitely is trying to combat that with some of her answers.
Former President Trump says he will vote to support abortion rights in Florida. Trump weighed in on a ballot question before voters this November that would overturn the state's 6-week abortion ban and allow abortions up to the point of viability, generally considered to be about 24 weeks. On one hand, Trump is in line with polling that shows a majority of Floridians support the pro-abortion rights amendment, but doesn't he risk alienating a crucial part of the Republican base?
We have seen Trump this campaign lean more against these really strict abortion laws and try to be more in the center, be more, like you said, on the line of where Americans are feeling about these restrictive abortion laws. So him saying this, I think, opens him up to maybe some voters who have thought that the Republican states that have implemented these abortion laws in the wake of the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade have gone too far. But could it alienate him from, the far right base, or, the evangelicals Christian right that have supported his candidacy for now almost a decade? It's a question that I think, is balancing internally of, are these people in my camp enough that I can veer a little more towards the center on abortion? They still won't abandon me for, say, a Vice President Harris. And he's toying with this. And I think trying to be more where the majority of Americans are, trusting that the Christian right will still support his candidacy. So it's definitely a gamble. But I think that the former president wants to show that he can be moderate on an issue like abortion, just to try to also appeal to these pivotal voters that both camps are trying to get.
Yeah, we've seen some pretty visceral reaction from the pro-life movement, at least on social media, so it'll be interesting to see where they end up come Election Day. Another announcement putting Trump at odds with some pro-life voters came during a town hall yesterday. In Wisconsin, Trump said he would force private insurance or have the government pay for IVF treatments for people dealing with infertility. This is another issue where the majority of Americans might support his position, but a key part of his base disagrees.
That's right. I think he is, again, trying to appeal to the majority of Americans, but there is a part of his base, the Catholics don't agree that IVF is a acceptable treatment, far right conservative Christians. And so I think this is another gamble from the former president, trying to see if he can appeal to the center here while holding on to those other voters. I also think this was an effort for him to squash some of this rhetoric that Republicans are against IVF. And he's trying to say, I'm not against IVF. I won't do anything. If anything, I'll do more to encourage Americans to use IVF, because this is something that has haunted the Republican Party since the Alabama Supreme Court decided that embryos are humans, which definitely did a lot to harm the IVF usage in that state. So I think he's trying to fight back on that narrative and say, yes, there are people in my party that are against the use of IVF. There are some of my supporters, but I personally am not going to do anything to harm that. If anything, I'll encourage usage of it, just to, again, try to appeal a little bit more than he has been able to in his past elections to the center.
Donald Trump's campaign is lashing out at Fox News over a new poll It released showing Kamala Harris leading in 3 Sunbelt states, Arizona, Georgia, and Nevada. The Trump campaign pointed out he was actually losing those states by more in 2020. Is this just the tried and true political strategy of when you're losing in the polls, criticize the polls?
That's right. I mean, we saw it with President Biden's former campaign when we would be focused on the polls and that he was not gaining traction on the former president. They would say, polls as far out don't mean anything. So I think we're seeing the same thing from former President Trump. Now that Vice President Harris is gaining in the polls, he's going to say, the polls aren't a fair read on what's going on in this election. So it's a typical, strategy to say, don't trust the polls, or for him to say, I was doing worse in 2016 and I went and won the election. But I do think it shows that they are feeling the pressure from Vice President Harris's campaign. And they definitely have over the last month of her candidacy, that she's gaining in the polls. She has the momentum behind her. Then this honeymoon period is not ending anytime soon. We saw a few polls this week that showed her gaining ground in the Sunbelt states and even ahead of Trump. So I think they're feeling the pressure, and to turn to, blaming the polls and blaming the outlets that came out with them is definitely a tactic used by politicians.
Republican vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance was in Boston this week and did not receive the warmest reception at a firefighter union event. Take a listen.
President Trump and I are proud to be the most pro-worker Republican ticket in history. And I want to talk about why we're fighting for working people, why we're going to fight for unions and non-union alike.
And that efforts by Trump and Vance to position themselves as a pro-labor ticket face some critics. But Trump has had some success in the past winning over union workers. What is the state of play when it comes to union votes in this presidential race?
Yeah, so we're seeing the Trump campaign trying to get back the coalition that won him the White House in 2016. And a lot of that was these labor workers who resonated with some of his policies, especially his anti-China rhetoric and keeping jobs in America. So they voted for him in 2016. Then in 2020, we saw some of these union groups, the workers themselves, of course, big labor, did endorse Biden and has endorsed Harris largely, but these workers themselves in states like Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, these pivotal states, then turned to Biden in 2020, especially after some of the manufacturing promises and growth of plants that Trump had promised on the campaign trail didn't come to fruition. So now Trump's trying to get those folks back into his camp. And I think talking about, that we're this pro-union party is part of that effort. And of course, having Senator J.D. Vance on his ticket is part of that effort. Somebody from a manufacturing town in Ohio, and sending him out to talk to union groups to try to resonate with those people, because Vance has a background similar to some other folks who he's talking with when he's on the trail in those key battleground states. So it's all part of this larger effort, but it's interesting how much the tides have shifted for some of these union workers, and November will tell, if they're resonating more with the Trump platform or with the Democrats' platform that's now Harris's race.
Be a very key constituency to watch, especially in those blue wall states in the Midwest. The Hill's Alex Gangitano, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Former President Trump is asking a federal court to take over his hush money case. Trump and his team have requested that the U.S. District Court in Manhattan seize the case from New York State, arguing its prosecution violated his constitutional rights. The request comes after the Supreme Court issued a ruling on presidential immunity, granting broad protections for a president carrying out official acts. Trump is seeking to overturn his conviction and move back again his sentencing that's set for September 18th. The former president was convicted on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records and was set to be sentenced in July before the date was pushed back. Trump's team requested last year for the case to be turned over to a federal court, but was denied. Former President Trump's campaign in a battle with yet another artist over rights to their music. Jack White of the band The White Stripes took to Instagram on Thursday, writing, quote, "Don't even think about using my music, you fascists," end quote. That post was in response to Trump's deputy director of communications posting a clip to social media that included part of the White Stripes' 2003 hit, Seven Nation Army. In his response, White also criticized the former president for his staffers' conduct at the Arlington National Cemetery this week. It's just the latest artist to criticize the campaign for using their music. Earlier this week, Celine Dion questioned the use of her 1997 hit, My Heart Will Go On. And just last week, the Foo Fighters fought back against the Trump campaign's use of their song, My Hero. New numbers from the Bureau of Economic Analysis show inflation held steady in the month of July, and it could have a big impact on the Fed's decision on whether or not to cut interest rates. The Personal Consumption Expenditures Index is the Fed's preferred way to measure inflation. The index showed a 2.5% rise since July of 2023. Meantime, household incomes and spending rose slightly. Those numbers are close to the expectations of economists. That's good news for consumers who may be expecting interest rate cuts. The Fed meets again next month, and Chair Jerome Powell has said that he is in favor of cutting rates at that meeting. The Biden administration has released a plan to expand solar development across the western U.S. The Bureau of Land Management is proposing 31 million acres of public lands to be used for potential solar energy development. The outline, dubbed the Western Solar Plan, seeks to use land in 11 states identified as prime areas for solar energy. According to the Bureau, land will only be used if it's within 15 miles of an existing or planned high-voltage transmission line. The proposal kicks off a 30-day public protest period and a 60-day review window for impacted governors in the western states. That's it for today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petrimo. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hills YouTube channel, and come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.